Good. So howdy. It's nice to see you guys. Hope everything's going well. Since you guys are seniors, there's no STAR test. My younger students were, what were they doing? Um, English STAR test. I said, well, I'm sure it went well. How hard could it be, right? Okay. And then they take the US history one. I guess you guys got to skip that, which is sad. Missed out on that. All right. Let me
I
see.
think we did it.
Did you guys do it? It was last year, or did you skip it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it was first semester that we took it actually,
Oh,
or I
okay.
guess early second semester.
Yeah. Maybe you did get it in before we went online. I don't know. All right. Let's see if I can find all the right stuff. Weekly question. Here we go. All right. Analyze. No, we already did that. Basic premise of Confederate government. I think you turned that one in already. And was Reconstruction a success or failure? Is that where we're at? I think it is. Or maybe you didn't. I don't know when you turned stuff in. You already turned in the Confederate one, I think. So, was Reconstruction a success or a failure? Was it something in between? In your response, consider land policy, key legislation during presidential and radical Reconstruction, Southern politics, racial and political violence, and Northern fatigue. That's a lot of stuff. Make sure you make clear what you mean by success or failure. I will tell you things that I will be concerned about if you don't mention. If you don't mention the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, I will be concerned because that's some fairly key legislation. We hardly ever add constitutional amendments, and we added 3. Now, some will enforce them fairly strictly for a few years, and then we'll kind of forget they exist toward the end of the period. So, I mean, you'll definitely want to mention that, but the fact that they're there does matter. And the fact that they were enforced briefly matters. And the fact that they're there means that later on we can bring them back up when we're in the mood to enforce them, which is kind of what we do. I would also expect toward the end of your answer some mention of the election of 1876 and compromise of 1877, or bargain. I think your book calls it the bargain of 1877. Now, this question is due next Friday, so no huge rush on this. We'll start talking about it a little bit today, and we'll probably talk about it a little bit more next time, and then a little bit more next Tuesday. Sorry, not Monday. Next Tuesday. And I, don't know how many. I was just thinking I didn't post the recordings from earlier today. What the heck? But I don't know if you have to miss class next week or this week for some AP exam. But if I remember, I'll post the recordings, of course. So hopefully that'll help. And we'll talk about Reconstruction, that chapter here, momentarily, and maybe go over a couple of things from the one before. Also, today I posted the review for the quiz because I forgot to post it last week, mostly because I forgot to finish it. So sorry. Quiz is written, I just forgot to write the review. So apologies. And hopefully I posted the review and not the quiz. Every once in a while, I worry about stuff like that. Posting the quiz would give you a huge advantage, though, wouldn't it? The optional assignment, May 10th. That is next Monday. Yeah, Monday. Yeah. I explained one extremely important event mentioned in this class that was not directly part of the weekly question of a weekly question. So explain what the event was, the when, where, who, what, why, all that stuff. The why is the significance. And it needs to happen during the period that the class covers. So beginning of US history to Reconstruction. So, and anything that I didn't directly ask you about. So it could be Civil War, Mexican War, pick a person, pick a law that you thought was really important. Could be something about Texas, because Texas is crucial, of course. So, anything you think is really important, you just have to argue that it's important. This, when it says optional, that's completely true. It won't count as part of your point total. So think of it as an extra credit, and if you have time, great. If you don't, no loss. So do it if you can, or if you have time, or if you feel like it, and if you don't, it's not a problem. Okay. Sorry, I looked at my phone because somebody keeps texting, so I'm going to turn it over because we don't care, do we? No. Isn't that weird how stuff distracts you? Not you, of course, just me. Did you guys see the interview with the president and the first lady? They went to some elementary school and they asked the kids how online learning was going. And one kid said it was great because you can eat and take naps whenever you want to. Like, that is probably the most honest assessment of online learning that anyone has ever given. You can eat and take naps when you need to. So good job. So there you are. Okay. The notes. Yeah, let's talk about the stuff. I want to go back over the amendments because I just said that they were important for you to talk about in your discussion. So sorry for the yawn of the weekly questions. So 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment are referred to as the Civil War amendments because they're passed because of the Civil War. 13th Amendment does what Lincoln said the war was about, ends slavery. This is official before the war ends, right as the war ends, to be honest. And it bans slavery everywhere. So by the time the war is over, the northern states, the border states that had slavery had gotten rid of it by then. So it's progress. And might as well ban it because that's what the war was about. Now, there is a little thing in there, exception, that says that slavery is illegal except for punishment of a crime. So what you'll end up seeing as the period of Reconstruction ends is southern states in particular starting to charge Black men with crimes and then forcing them to work for the city or the state. And you'll see that in Midwestern areas with poorer people, and you see it a lot during Reconstruction. What I mean by them being briefly enforced, it talks about it in, there's a question that says, when I say the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were briefly enforced, what do I mean? Really during the Johnson administration, so first presidency after the Civil War, and then a little bit in the first Grant administration. But as you read through the chapter 15, you'll notice that there's less and less desire to make sure that African Americans are treated equally. So by the end of the Reconstruction period, the 13th Amendment, they're not bringing back slavery, but they are going to arrest lots of Black men and make them work essentially for free for the city or the state. You're going to see difficult work systems that include sharecropping, where people can't leave their job because they're in debt, and they're in debt because they never had any money, so they couldn't have a place to live. So their former owner says, hey, you can live here as part of your wages. And they let them borrow money because you only get paid when the crop comes in. So they let them borrow money, but charge them pretty high interest. And then they pass laws that say you can't leave your current job if you owe your employer money. So it kind of creates a system that looks like slavery. The 14th Amendment, equal protection, citizenship for former slaves, except they're going to have different sets of laws called Black Codes, or you'll end up seeing them called Jim Crow laws that have different sets of restrictions if you're Black or white. And then the 15th Amendment, which says former slaves can vote. Southern states will start adding voting restrictions, including things like literacy tests or poll taxes, POLL taxes. So if you want to vote, you have to pay a fee. And you're already in debt to your employer and you probably can't afford the fee. So it really does keep Black men from voting. It keeps African Americans from having equality. until the federal government decides to enforce some of these laws to get rid of the idea of being imprisoned for labor as part of a punishment. The idea of getting rid of those separate codes that say what kind of job you can have, where you can go to school, where you can live, that sort of thing. And then the 15th Amendment, they'll eventually make both the poll tax and literacy tests and other weird requirements they have for voting illegal. But by eventually, I mean 1960s. So what you'll see is these amendments enforced pretty strictly in the 1860s, until about 1870. And then you start to see it kind of go away. And then in 1877, we're not even pretending anymore, which is kind of why I wanted you to mention that compromise or bargain of 1877. And then you see this come back really with the civil rights movement, a little bit, with Brown versus Board of Education, as far as 14th Amendment in school and that sort of thing. But you see it in a bigger way during the 1960s part of the civil rights movement with the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act and some other stuff too. Those are the main things. All right, so I guess I did just sort of go through all these amendments, didn't I? So 13th, end slavery. 14th, citizenship and equal protection for former slaves. The goal here is to reverse the Dred Scott decision that says that if you're Black, you're not a citizen, and it does that. The equal protection, yeah, only briefly, and then again, more so after the Civil Rights Movement. And then the 15th Amendment. This becomes controversial, and we'll talk about this probably next time a little bit. Becomes controversial because women will be upset that they didn't get the right to vote. And you'll also see some discussion among women's rights groups, especially educated women, where they'll talk about how is it fair to let ignorant Black men vote when educated white women don't get to? And that will appear to be just a little racist. So it's not the high point of the feminist movement. That's the understatement of the day. All right. And let's see. I think we finished this last time where we talked about General Sherman's, what is it? Field order. I can't remember the number, 15-5 something, some field order. Where he takes the plantation owner's property and gives possession of that to the former slaves. And they do well and make money and run the farms really well. And it's supposed to be sort of a sign that if African Americans have the ability to own land and run their own farms, that they will be equally successful to white men in the South. And if you remember, there certainly had been a paternalistic argument that part of the reason slavery was essential was because Black men couldn't figure out how to take care of themselves without the direction of white men. Okay. All right. So Civil War is ending and Abraham Lincoln runs for re-election. In the beginning of 64, it's probably not a slam dunk for him. By the end of 64, it's very clear he's going to win because it's very clear the Civil War is almost over. Beginning of 64, a little in doubt, but we'd have the big battles in 63 that were at least a turning point, being Gettysburg and Vicksburg. But by 64, everything was going the way of the North by the election. So it's really clear Lincoln was going to win. The guy who ran against him was that McClellan fellow, who had been the general in charge of the Union Army at the beginning of the war, and then Lincoln fired him because he had trouble making decisions quickly. So he'd said he had a case of the slows, which sounds bad, doesn't it? Because it was bad. All right. So Lincoln wins re-election, and his second inaugural address, which I think is probably one of the greatest speeches in U.S. history. Yeah, so if you ever have to look at a speech, I think that's a good one. He talks about how both the North and the South were at fault because of slavery. It's clear slavery is wrong, that God didn't like slavery, and the North's at fault because they could have ended it, but they kept perpetuating it. And the South was at fault because they had it and were willing to fight to keep it. And he said, both sides said that God was on their side. Both sides read the same Bible and found justification for their actions in that Bible. But clearly, God was mad at both of them, which is why he let them have a big war over this. And the end result of ending slavery was clearly the will of God. And at the end of that war, then rather than punishing other folks, it was time to get back together peacefully, to take care of the widows and orphans, and to bind up the nation's wounds. So it's really lovely speech. I'm always convinced that Abraham Lincoln is the best public speaker of all presidents because I was there and I heard him, or because the speeches were really on point and short. And you guys have had speech classes. The current presidents speak, if they give a speech, it's at least an hour. And nobody remembers what they heard in an hour-long speech, unless you took notes and it was for your government class or something. So Lincoln gave like 5-minute speeches at the most and made his point. And he understood too, in that era, everybody read the Bible. So he quotes the Bible a bunch and it's really meaningful to his audience. And, if you're one of those folks that for a variety of reasons got to study the Bible quite a bit when you were younger, you'll look at it and go like, yeah, he is quoting the Bible a bunch. All right. So Lincoln, good speaker. I highly recommend looking at his speeches if you ever get the chance. There aren't any videos. It's a long time ago. All right. So divine retribution, God's punishment. All right. More stuff. I feel like I'm skipping the chat, but you guys probably haven't said anything. So say something in the chat and I'll try to pay attention, or don't. It's fine either way. Things that you start to see developing during this time period, Black college systems. So traditionally Black colleges start during this era, primarily in the South, for a couple of reasons. One, that's where most African Americans live. And two, there just really aren't that many colleges in the South either way. So most states would have a college, but it may be a really recent college because of the Morrill Land Grant Act. So these traditionally Black colleges are almost exclusively private colleges. The two most famous are Hampton Institute in Virginia. That's where Booker T. Washington went. And then Booker T. Washington started Tuskegee in Alabama. And in the 1302 class, there's probably more discussion of Booker T. Washington and the Atlanta Compromise and how Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois saw the role of education for African Americans differently, but Black colleges in the South would help African American men get some skills that they needed probably to start a business. To be honest, would be really unusual for a white man to hire a Black man to work in his business. So typically African American men who are going to be successful will probably own their own business. So you're going to need background in how to run a business, so some sort of finance and investment strategies. Also, it's going to be an agricultural business probably because it's the South. So agricultural skills and also fixing stuff. So Tuskegee, they taught you how to build houses and buildings and how to fix farm equipment. And that was part of Du Bois' complaints about Tuskegee because it was too agricultural in focus. And Washington's like, hey, we live in the South. So we're not all going to be doctors and lawyers down here. All right. Frederick Douglass, they'll quote him several times in this chapter, as they should, because he's famous and stuff and impactful. He is going to say that the Civil War and ending slavery is not the end of the movement, but the beginning. So it's the beginning of fulfilling the promise of equality, but it's the start, not the finish. So you'll notice that, and it makes a lot of sense. All right. Probably the most successful email. Why am I thinking email? The most successful government bureau or email, goodness, of the time period is the Freedmen's Bureau. And the Freedmen's Bureau is created as the Civil War ends to help with end of Civil War stuff, like finding your family. If you were separated from them at any point during slavery, maybe you got sold, something happened that you got separated from your family. It could have been because of the war. So finding your family, and also some healthcare stuff. So basic healthcare, sanitary sort of stuff, keeping clean, getting rid of infection, that sort of thing. Potentially redistribution of plantation land, because they tried that a little bit with General Sherman. It seemed to work, and there was talk of every African-American family in the South getting 40 acres and a mule. So if you've ever heard talk of that, the plan was that the Freedmen's Bureau would be the agency that redistributed the land. But probably the most successful thing was reuniting families and then teaching basic literacy, because you're not going to be a slave anymore, so you're going to have to negotiate for, maybe potentially a work contract, your salary, that kind of thing. So you want to have basic literacy skills. And the goal was to get the basic literacy skills, really having trouble talking today, of African Americans to the level of white Americans in the South. And to be fair, it's a fairly low standard during this time period because there's not public school in the South. So basic literacy is about what everybody had. It's just kind of the truth. So also, I think I'll just mention this. I assume you know things like this, but assumption isn't always the best strategy, is it? So people did not call African Americans during this time period. So even though, I make reference to African Americans, if you read literature of the time period, that's probably not the word that you're going to see. And I'm trying to think what the proper word. They probably they might say Black. In some places, they might say Negro. Of course, there's always some slang stuff that's very defamatory or derogatory, and you know how that is, and that's not, of course, what we would say. But I think what you'll notice when you talk about African American history is that over time, even the proper term for the era changes over time. So I only say that because sometimes, like last week, somebody wrote an essay or a weekly question answer, and they kept talking about colored people. It's like, no colored people. So it's tricky. All right, it's really not that tricky, but you got to remember. Okay, back to business. So Freedmen's Bureau, fairly successful, famous people who worked with the Freedmen's Bureau, of course, Frederick Douglass, but also Sojourner Truth was probably the one who worked with it the most. So Andrew Johnson, you probably noticed he became president. Did you notice that? Because Lincoln, things didn't go well for Lincoln after the Civil War. Gives a really nice speech. Within a week, someone's assassinated him. And he's picked a very unusual fellow to be his vice president, primarily because who cares who the vice president is? They don't do very much stuff. Correct? Sometimes, except when the president dies and then they become president. So there's always that. So remember that when you guys run for president later on, you got to pick somebody who can really do the job if you can't. Okay, I know it's it's a negative thing to plan for, but Abraham Lincoln definitely not thinking about that when he picked Andrew Johnson. He picked Andrew Johnson, as it says in the note section here, because he was the only Southern senator who opposed secession and continued to serve in the Senate during the Civil War. So he was the only Southern senator loyal to the Union. So, Lincoln sees the end of the Civil War coming. His vice president dies. It's like, here's a chance. He even renames his party the Constitutional Union Party just for this election. So here is the opportunity to bring both the North and the South back together peacefully, to reward somebody from the South, at least, with a nominal position. meaning that it's a position where you get some prestige, but probably, not too many jobs. You might break a tie vote in the Senate, which there's definitely not going to be during this era because everybody in Congress is going to be from the North. So there probably won't be any tie votes. And you'll get to go to state events, maybe a funeral from time to time, but the vice president doesn't really do much. So, yeah, no harm, no foul, except Lincoln gets assassinated. Now, Johnson didn't do it, in case you're wondering. That was someone else. That Wilkes Booth, John Wilkes Booth guy. He also apparently thought slavery was a really good thing. So Andrew Johnson did as well. But Johnson's problem was slavery. He did have a problem with slavery, but his problem was the rich people kept all the slaves. He thought poor people should have at least one slave. So his quote about slavery is that every family should own a slave to relieve the drudgery of daily life. So his problem was that they were not well distributed throughout the white population. It's like, this is absolutely not the guy that you want in charge after the Civil War. And unfortunately, that's the guy who's in charge after the Civil War. And it's going to be messy. It is. Yeah, not the soccer player, but actual mess. Time for water. Sorry. All right. So yeah, Lincoln's out, for obvious reasons, and Johnson is in. Now, when Johnson becomes president, it's during the recess. So, recess for Congress is kind of like recess for you as a kid. You go out and play, only theirs lasts for several months. So they were not going to come back into session until late April, early May. So in the meantime, Johnson tells the Southern states, you know what? You just send whoever you want to Congress and we'll accept them. So he starts to pardon former Confederates, and he really loosens the rules. I shouldn't even say loosens the rules. There were no rules yet about how the South was going to send people back to Congress. That was one of the things they were fighting about. When Lincoln was president in the first term, he proposed something called the 10% plan for Reconstruction. And what this meant was, or what this said, was that if a Southern state had 10% of their eligible voters pledge future allegiance to the United States, then they could hold elections for Congress. Congress was not okay with that plan. They said that is way too lenient. There's no punishment at all. What the heck are you doing? That's not cool. So they proposed something called the Wade-Davis plan. And that was proposed by two senators, Wade and Davis, would be their last names. And it said that unless a Southern state could have 50% of their eligible voters swear that they had never voluntarily supported the Confederacy, then they couldn't have elections. Well, as you can imagine, there was no Southern state that could have 50% of their eligible voters swear that and not lie. So the Wade-Davis plan really sets up a situation where there's not going to be any Southern elections for, 4 to 6 years at the very least. So that's the plan that passes through Congress during Lincoln's first term. And when it comes to his desk, he decides not to sign it. Now, if a president gets a bill during the normal part of the legislative session, then if he doesn't sign the bill, it becomes law. He just doesn't approve of it. At the last 15 days of a legislative session, if the president doesn't sign it, it's something called a pocket veto. So he's not like in your face, here's the veto stamp, I'm not signing it. But it's more like, let's talk about this later. So he gives them the, let's talk about this later veto, the pocket veto, which allows the law to expire, and then they can bring it back the next session and talk about it again. And Lincoln's thought was, we'll be calmer, we'll be cooler, we'll be, in better, a better mood or more rational. So let's bring it back and talk about it then. And of course, he wasn't there when they brought it back later. So the Wade Davis plan is much harsher. It's not going to be the one that they decide on either. But Congress is going to be super frustrated with Andrew Johnson when they show up and all these guys from the South show up. And Congress hasn't even talked about a Reconstruction plan. So Congress says essentially to the president, look, this is not your job. We are the ones who decide this, not you. So these guys cannot be sworn into Congress. And then Johnson and Congress fight and fight and fight. So they will eventually come up with a Reconstruction plan. And we'll talk more specifically about Reconstruction plans and other stuff next time. I don't want to get into that too much. We'll also talk more about impeachment next time. So we're not quite done. Don't give up just yet. Although we might have time. Let me look. Maybe we could talk about impeachment. I bet we can get it in. It'll just take a minute or 10. All right. So Congress and Johnson don't like each other. And what this ends up doing is pushing anybody who had kind of been in the middle. If you've been moderate, there's no middle. So you either think that Johnson should be allowed to seat whoever he wants in Congress and that you give the South more rights, or you kind of slide all the way over to the radical Republican side, which is Johnson is always wrong, and African Americans and whites should be equal before the law. And that's kind of where Congress ends up. Not so much because most people in Congress think that, because truthfully they don't, but because most people in Congress really, really dislike Andrew Johnson. So anything he wants that seems to be pro-South, they're going to do the opposite of. And one of the things that you'll probably notice is that the North during this time period, during the Johnson administration, really seems to be quite serious about promoting equality for former slaves. And I will suggest to you that the people who lead Congress, who lead the Republicans in Congress, like Charles Sumner and Thaddeus Stevens. Sumner's the lead Republican in the Senate, and Thaddeus Stevens is the lead Republican in the House. Those two guys completely serious about this. They think blacks and whites should be treated equally, and they're not kidding around about it. The other, most of the other congressmen, it's like, yeah, if this irritates the South, let's do it. And the goal of those guys would be to give blacks equality in the South because they will remain in the South. So when it's time to vote and the 15th Amendment's enabled, and then you'll have some Reconstruction plan that probably will limit white voting. And in some of those states, blacks are already the majority. Then what you will see is that the South will turn Republican. So a lot of times the Republicans in the North are supporting voting rights for blacks in the South because they know blacks in the South will vote for Republicans. And they're correct about that. They are, because blacks in the South are going to vote for the party of Lincoln, which is the Republican Party. So there you go. And whites in the South are going to vote for the Democrats because they didn't want to end slavery. So in the South, you'll see white voters vote for Democrats, honestly, really until Reagan, for a really long time. Yeah. And it's probably odd because in your whole lifetime, white people in the South tend to vote for Republicans. Pretty much everybody in the South votes for some Republicans. It's not completely true, but it's a lot true. You know? But that's really recent historically. All right. So Johnson and Congress are fighting with each other. Congress is supportive of voting rights and equality for blacks in the South, primarily because they want them to remain in the South, and they would like to see them start to vote for Republicans. All right. So the end result of the feud with Andrew Johnson and the Republicans in Congress is impeachment. Now, you've been fortunate enough to see an impeachment or two recently in your lifetimes, yes? And that would be of that Trump fellow. Did you notice Trump impeaching him? Um, I'm trying to think out loud. Why did we impeach Trump? The first one I think was suspicion of Russian collusion in the election, I think. And then the second one was about that, the crazy stuff that happened on January 6th. And that was the post-presidential impeachment. So that's a first in history, isn't it? When you get impeached when you're no longer president. So that's interesting stuff. But when Congress is mad at you for a variety of reasons, and there's pretty big split between the political parties, impeachment can happen from time to time. Now, the only impeachments that have gone all the way through to the end are the Johnson, this one, Clinton, Bill Clinton, because he might have lied under oath about a special relationship he had with an intern. And then, of course, Trump with those two. All right. Typically, when a president's impeached, there's no chance they're going to be convicted. The only one who might have been convicted was Nixon, but he quit before they finished. So there you go. All right. This was really close, though. This was because everybody was just irritated with Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson kept vetoing all the stuff they would pass. Even though sometimes they would override the vetoes, it would get annoying. He would come to Congress from time to time and cuss them out, and they found that to be annoying as well. So he's pretty intemperate and annoying. So they said, you know what, let's get rid of this dude. But he wasn't really much of a lawbreaker. So they decided to pass a law that they knew he would break. And the law was called the Tenure, Tenure, of Office Act. This thing right, let me see if I can highlight it or something. There we go, Tenure of Office Act. So tenure is length. So this act said that if the president wanted to fire an official, an advisor who had been approved by the Senate or confirmed by the Senate, that he had to get the Senate's approval before he could fire them. Now, the reason they passed this bill is because Andrew Johnson was about to fire the last of Abraham Lincoln's cabinet members, and that was, who was that? It was the Secretary of State. Why can't I think of his name? I can't think of his name. Goodness, I've had this problem a couple times today. So he wanted to fire Seward. That's who it is, William Seward. Oh my gosh, don't you hate it when you can't remember William Seward's name? He was trying to fire, he was going to fire William Seward. And Congress didn't care about William Seward. They just wanted an excuse to impeach Andrew Johnson. So they passed this law, and Johnson vetoes the law, and then they override the veto. And his thought is, this is unconstitutional, which it probably was. So the Supreme Court will stick up for me, which they honestly probably would have, because they were pretty conservative, and lots of former, sorry for the yawn, lots of former slaveholders on the Supreme Court during that time period. So he's probably right about that. But as soon as he violates the law, the Congress says, ha ha, you broke a law, let's impeach him. So they did. So the House passed the articles of impeachment, and the Senate decided to have the trial. And what ends up happening is Andrew Johnson's attorneys meet with the lead Republicans in the Senate, and they say, hey, it's the last year of his term, he's not running again. So since it's his last year and he's not running again, he promises he's not going to, veto a whole bunch of your stuff anymore. Truthfully, they're almost done anyway. Can we just call it a day and be done with it? And they said, okay, that's fine. So a handful of Republicans decided not to vote for impeachment, and he ends up, or for conviction. So he ends up missing conviction by one vote. And I think it was 6 Republicans who voted against impeachment. So he ends up not, or getting, voted against conviction in the impeachment trial. So he clearly had violated the law, but they'd set up an unconstitutional law because they knew he was going to do that. So they set him up. They understood that it was completely political. And this impeachment was completely political. Most people would not suggest, well, most people would suggest that the Clinton impeachment was political. I would suggest that to you all day. Clearly, he was guilty of lying under oath about an affair, but the senators were like, "We're not touching that thing because, yeah, we probably would do the same thing." And then I have no idea what you think about the Trump impeachment. Probably too early to make a historical assessment of the Trump impeachment. Everybody knows Nixon did something wrong. Whether you think it was, big enough or bad enough for him to deserve to be kicked out of office, that's a whole different thing. Although most people in the modern era think, nah, destroying evidence that the Supreme Court had ordered you to turn over, it's pretty bad. Yeah. I think that. My parents, my dad, my mom too. My mom loved Richard Nixon. I don't understand that. Parents, what are you going to do? All right, so Congress passes Tenure of Office Act. Johnson gets impeached, but not convicted. Finishes the final year, does not run for re-election, but weirdly enough, he does run for Congress a couple of years later, and he gets elected as a congressman from Tennessee, a representative. And then he goes in and Congress, claps and applauds and tells him to give a speech. And so he gives a speech where he cusses them all out for impeaching him. So go Johnson. Yeah, Johnson did not change. All right. I feel like we've said enough for one day. Do you feel the same way? I know you thought that like 10 minutes ago. Tell the truth. Don't tell the truth. All right. Okay, so before we go, do you guys have any questions? Mm-mm. See, I can tell that some of you agree the best thing about online classes is you could take a nap and eat.